come a couple, 3 days before from feeding the 5,000 there on the hill. And then after that, a couple of days later, it was a rainstorm at night. The disciples were out on the sea, and the storm was bad, and they got scared. And Jesus walked across the water to calm their fears. And from there they went to the small village of Gennesaret, and they stayed there for several days. And we pick up in Mark chapter 7 today, where they were leaving Gennesaret. Mark 7, verse 24. From there, Jesus set out for the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house there where he didn't think he would be found, but he couldn't escape notice. He was barely inside when a woman who had a disturbed daughter heard where he was. She came and knelt at his feet, begging for help. The woman was Greek, Syrophoenician by birth. She asked him to cure her daughter. Listen to Jesus' words and try and imagine the tone of voice. Stand in line and take your turn. The children get fed first. If there's any left over, dogs get it. She said, of course, Master, but don't dogs under the table get scraps dropped by the children? That impressed Jesus. You're right. Be on your way. Your daughter is no longer disturbed. The demonic affliction is gone. So she went home and found her daughter relaxed on the bed. The torment of the demon was gone for good. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
What would any one of you all think that if I told you on your tombstone, which is 400 years away, I'm sure, for all of us, please, Lord, but on your tombstone, there was a very short 4-word epitaph. That's it, just 4 words. Well, your answer to that question might be, it would depend upon who wrote that epitaph. I don't want any of my children to write it, I can tell you that. Was it an enemy? Or was it someone who loved you? It also might depend, you might answer, on how well that person knew you and understood you. It also, depended upon other things all around you and how your life had been. If a newspaper critic one day wrote of a concert pianist the 4 words, he was a failure, you could always reply to that, well, that was just one man's opinion. And you could probably argue with it somewhat. He could be right, he could be wrong. So this morning we run across a character in the Gospel of Mark who was once described with 4 immortal words. And those words were, great is your faith. She was a Canaanite woman who came from the country to the north of Palestine, Canaan. And that was a country that did not like the Jewish people. They were hostile, openly hostile to the Jews. We know she had at least 1 child, but we don't know if she was married. We don't know if she was a good lady or if she was a bad lady. That 1 child, that's about all that we know about her. We don't even know what her name was. All we know is that this is her one and only encounter with Jesus. And here he spoke to her this 4-word epitaph. Great is your faith. Only 4 words he spoke, but they were enough to make her immortal. And we can trust these words to be true because whose mouth did they come out of? They came out of the expert. They came out of the mouth of the expert on faith. Jesus searched for faith. Ask, kind of like a bird watcher searches for a rare bird. That's what Jesus was looking for. And you know what? He didn't always find it in those closest to him. He didn't always find it in his disciples. On no occasion in the scriptures do we ever know of him saying to them, "Great is your faith." More often, what did he say to them? "O ye of little faith." That was what he said to Jesus. To the disciples. So we regard this woman from the land of Canaan with more than just a passing interest. She awakens in us this feeling of admiration. Maybe it's a feeling of envy because she stands. She stands where most of us would love to stand. What faithful Christian would not like it to be said of him or her, "Great is your faith"? Think of what it would mean to an aspiring, a young, with his future before him artist to have had Picasso place his hand on that aspiring artist's shoulder and say, "You have great talent." How wonderful it would be, folks, then to be a believer, for us to be a believer in God, if Jesus would come up to us and put his hand on my shoulder and on your shoulder, and he would say those words, "You have a remarkable talent for faith." So the question is, how do we qualify for this kind of praise? What is it that we have to do to get us? Good question. As Christians, I think we might ponder that occasionally. So let's take a look at the story of the Canaanite woman. First, we could say that this woman, that she was willing to cross barriers. She didn't take the status quo for granted. Her faith consisted pretty much that she turned to Jesus for help. And that in and of itself is really kind of remarkable when you remember that she was a Canaanite, therefore she was a Gentile, therefore she was a traditional enemy of the Jewish people. The two peoples had despised each other for centuries, and it was as real a hatred as exists today in our world, in this morning's newspaper, as exists between the Arabs and the Jews in our lives today. And knowing the hatred, we might wonder what Jesus was doing. Why was he in this foreign land? On no other occasion in the Bible do we find him venturing away from Palestine. So why now? And the common explanation that a number of commentators come together on is that he knew he was coming to the end of his ministry and he needed privacy to further train his disciples, his followers, to carry on after his death. And he couldn't find this privacy in Palestine, so he went into Gentile territory where most people would not know him. And at least they would pay very little attention to him. And it was very unlikely that a Canaanite would approach, much less consult, what was Jesus? Consult a Jewish rabbi. They would have walked way over on the other side of the road so that they didn't have to confront him. The prejudices back then, just like they do today in that part of the world, were just too deep. Yet, here was this woman who had a desperate need, and I think those of us that are parents can understand it very well. Her daughter was deathly ill, so she was willing to cross over and turn to Jesus for help. And there we begin to see her faith. Faith still in the 21st century consists of turning to Christ, of turning to Jesus for help. And even today, barriers still must be crossed. The first barrier is a barrier of 2,000 years. You know, that's a long time since Jesus was around, and now we're here. Jesus lived then, and we live now, and that's just the fact of life. And we think it's such a different ball game, and it is today, than it was back then. How can Jesus possibly help me? I know all about AI. He never heard of AI. I know 4 passwords. He didn't know any passwords. You know, how can he possibly help me? And then there is this barrier of culture difference. A generation, us, that travels faster than the speed of sound. How can we have anything in common with somebody whose fastest conveyance, most rapid conveyance, is a donkey? You know, that's pretty much of a stretch. I have trouble with it. Can Jesus even understand the problems that we face? And then there's the barrier of pride, perhaps. Am I willing to get over myself? Am I willing to get over myself and admit that I am not able to handle every situation that comes into my life? Are we able to cross the barrier that says, I don't need you, Jesus. I'm pretty smart. I'm pretty much self-sufficient, and I'm doing quite well all by myself. So it seems clear that when this lady, I wish we knew her name. I like calling people by name. When she turned to Jesus for help, she really knew very, very little of him. So she first addressed him simply by saying, "Sir." That was how she opened the conversation. But then she was unsure whether she had given him the proper title. So if you read on a little bit further, she added, "Sir, Son of David." And undoubtedly, there is no doubt that she had heard about the great powers that Jesus had, and she was willing to put down her pride and cry out for help. Have pity on me. But that was her faith and the extent of her understanding who Jesus was. Small, wasn't it? But it was enough for her to get to Jesus. Her faith simply existed in the fact that she came to Jesus for help in a situation where she had exhausted all of her own resources. Jesus had become her last resort. And how frequently that's us in the 21st century. But secondly, we can say that she was kind of strong-willed, stiff-necked in the Old Testament, hard-headed today. Call it what you want to, because she refused to be put off. And there were at least 3 intimidating things that could have made her give up. First of all, there was the silence, the dead silence of Jesus. The scriptures tell us that her cry of help and her outstretched hand, Jesus didn't say a word. Now that isn't like the Jesus that we would like to know and think we know. That was very uncharacteristic of Jesus, because there is no reaction that's harder to bear than dead silence. Even a flat-out no at least acknowledges presence of that other person and tells us where we stand. But when there is silence, when there is no answer, you don't know what the person is thinking, or even if they acknowledge your presence. So there's no sterner test of our faith sometimes than the silence of God. You know, if you think back to the Old Testament, it was that way to Job. He could have stood all of his endless suffering if only God seemingly